As I said, we're in Luke chapter 12. We've been in Luke chapter 12 for a while, but we are now down to verse 22. And this is in your study guide on page 55. If you have your study guide with you, page 55, and it's the second point on that page, point number 14. Last week we concluded our study of the parable of the rich fool, in which Jesus taught against covetousness and the concern about worldly things, and that I state that because that theme continues on, though he's completed his presentation of the parable. He has taught in that parable that covetousness or greed and concern about worldly things are not to be a part of the characteristic, or the character rather, of his disciples. We're to trust in the Lord, which brings us to the next point then, point 14, which is an exhortation to trust in God, as opposed, you see, to greed and covetousness and concern for acquiring more and more things of this world. Here's an exhortation to trust in God to provide what we need when we need it. And that's found in Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 34. My summary of this section is brief. In case I've lost anybody, we're on page 55 of your study guide, point number 14. In light of the parable just related, Jesus shows his disciples that they do not have to be, or they do not need rather, they do not need to be anxious about, and I think that's supposed to have an O in there someplace in that word. They do not need to be anxious about temporal things. Rather, they should trust completely in God, their Heavenly Father, who will surely provide for all their needs. Not necessarily, I'll interject, all their wants, but he'll provide for all of our needs. The final sentence, God takes care of his own. I don't think we're telling you anything you didn't already know before we read that. But it's something we need to remind ourselves of periodically, so we don't begin adopting the attitude of so many people in the world. So here we are, the exhortation to trust in God. Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 34. The dominant theme in this section is trust God. I'm going to say that so many times, you're going to go away with that ringing in your ears. Trust God, that's the theme. Don't worry about what men do. Don't worry about worldly wealth. Don't worry about physical needs. God provides what we really need. If we really need it, God provides it. So trust God. He's worthy of our trust. Hasn't he proven his love for us over and over and over again? Hasn't he culminated all of his gracious gifts to us by the sacrifice of his own Son upon the cross to redeem us eternally from our sins and give us a home in heaven? You can trust God. As the scripture says on another occasion, if he does these greater things, will he not also do the lesser things? That's paraphrased to put it in terms of this particular context. Trust God. This section could also be entitled, Jesus Teaches True Values. For in urging us not to pursue the things of the world, he teaches us what really is important and the things that the Lord God will give to us if we genuinely seek those things. Jesus teaches true values, and he parallels in his teaching here much of what he taught, or a good portion anyway, of what he taught in his Sermon on the Mount, particularly the portion of the Sermon on the Mount that covers 3 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew. The portion that covers Matthew chapter 6 echoes these thoughts, or maybe I should say these thoughts echo what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 6 in his Sermon on the Mount. We left off last week at verse 7, it seems like. It could be 7. I had that in mind from something else. Verse 22. Matthew chapter 12, verse 22. Yeah, good.
I looked up in the computer about the birds, and it says birds must eat at least half their own weight a day. and young ones even more. And tiny robins eat as much as 14 feet of earthworms each day. 14 feet long of earthworms. And you know, that blew my mind, because if that's so, then wow, they eat a lot of worms. And if God provides for them, what am I worrying about?
And that's what he's going to tell us before long. God does provide for those. But before we get to that portion of Scripture, there's an introduction to the section at verse 22. He has just completed the parable that we talked about. He addressed that parable to all those following him, disciples and non-disciples alike, those who were already committed to him and those who were not committed but were listening. So we got disciples and non-disciples. But verse 22 changes it. Verse 22 tells us, and he said unto his disciples, he addresses his followers now. Why especially to address them? He's going to warn them against the craving for the things of the world, craving for the things that people of this world crave. The best cars, best houses, best this, that. Whatever's new in the electronics field, we've got to have it because the people of the world got to have it. Don't allow the world to become your standard for guidance. Now, I'm not saying that we cannot have electronic devices. I'm not saying we can't have a nice car, but make certain that that's not your desire just for the sake of having those things. Ask yourself and ask God, do I really need these? If we need those things, then he'll make sure we have the ability to provide, to receive them. He'll provide for them. But we need to first establish, is this really God's will? Do I really need this thing? So don't get caught up in materialism. So Jesus says to his disciples, therefore I say unto you, let's go to verse 22. Verse 22, he said to his disciples, therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, neither for your body, what ye shall put on. Take no thought for your life. Does that mean we're not to make any plans at all? We don't plan for anything in the future? We just live in the present without giving any consideration to future things, to establishing some goals and achieving those goals? What does he mean when he says, take no thought? He's telling us, don't be anxious over material things. Don't give those things priority in your thinking. Be aware constantly that God will provide those things, and you can continue to ask God to provide things as long as you feel he may still be willing to do so. But there comes a time when we may have to honestly say to ourselves, it must not be God's will for me to have this. Or maybe it will be his will somewhere way down in the future. But I'm not detecting the idea that God wants me to have this in the immediate future. But as long as we really believe in our heart of hearts that God may want us to have something and have it now, and we feel that we really need it, it's not just something we want because it's out there, but we feel that we really need it. As long as we have that feeling in our heart, we can go ahead and continue to ask God for those blessings. And he's not telling us that we are not to have any physical possessions. He's simply telling us, don't make that the end objective for your life. Don't put things of the people, and don't worry about things. Don't worry about things. God will provide them when we're mature enough to use them, when we're not selfish in our motivation. If it's something we need, God will provide it at his own discretion for the right time. It may simply be that we want something that we wouldn't know what to do with it right now if we had it. But if we mature a little bit, or we get some other things going on in our lives, then we may be able to use those things. And so we can ask God, and he'll grant that petition. So never give up on prayer as long as you really think God still may want me to have this thing. But Jesus is teaching us essentially, don't get caught up in materialism. Don't get caught up in things. God provides what we really need, so do not worry. Don't be filled with anxiety. Don't be like those people in the world that have to drink a gallon of whatever that nasty stuff is, Pepto-Bismol, to calm their ulcers and such because they're worrying all the time.
Yes.
Don't worry. You have a loving Father who cares about you, who knows your needs better than you know them yourselves. And He wants to provide those things that you want if you really need them and if you know what to do with them once you get them. Verse 23, he says, the life is more than meat or food, and the body is more than raiment. There is more to man's existence, and I mean mankind, male and female alike. There is more to man's existence than food and clothing. I'm afraid sometimes at potluck luncheons we may get the impression that one of the greatest things in life is food. But there's more to life than food. There's more to life than modern designs and clothing. Material things are not the chief concern for a follower of Christ. Remember, He's talking to His disciples now. He says this to His disciples. He's teaching them and us that there's more to our lives than things. Material things are not the chief concern, or shouldn't be, mustn't be the chief concern. One writer said, God, not goods, is life's source. God, not goods, is life's source. Bill, did you ever thought?
Yeah, you know, the glorious things that are waiting for us in heaven is going to be just outnumbered and so glorious that, you know, these little precious things we're worried about down here, it's not going to amount to anything.
That is so true. We've got all the best stuff ahead of us.
Absolutely waiting for us.
We just have to get there.
And we can't even imagine what that glory and grandeur will be because we've never seen anything like it. We've never seen anything on that scale.
Yeah.
So trust God. He'll take care of our needs here. And when it's time for us to pass over Jordan, as the old song says, when we can pass over Jordan into the promised land of heaven, we'll find it's even more magnificent than we ever imagined.
Absolutely.
It is my firm conviction that no person upon this earth, outside of Jesus when He was here, fully comprehended what heaven is all about.
Yeah.
We cannot imagine such great things. He's just told us, don't worry. Don't worry, be happy. Not in a glib way, but don't worry. And because you don't have anything to worry about with God on your side, or you've been on God's side, then you can be happy.
Yes.
We can be content. We can be happy with what we have instead of worrying about what we don't have
Yeah.
and ignoring what we got. Haven't we all known people who had so much, but they still wanted more and they were not happy? And we thought, boy, if I just had a quarter of what that fellow had, I'd be as happy as anybody upon the earth. Whether that's true or not would all depend upon what our character is, if we had such things. But happiness for the believer does not depend upon things. And we have fairly good evidence that even among non-believers, even in the lives of unbelievers, we see enough of their lack of contentment, their lack of feeling secure, their lack of feeling enjoyment in life, rather than just making another dollar in life. God provides for his people. And that comes up in verse 27 then. God provides for his people. He says, consider the ravens. Consider the birds of the sky. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which neither have storehouse nor barn, and God feeds them. How much more are you better than the fowls? Aren't we greater? Aren't we greater in God's estimation and in the expression of God's love than the birds of the sky? God takes care of the birds of the sky. Won't he take care of his own children? Of course he will. I mean, it's absurd to think God takes care of all the birds, but he doesn't have the time or the will to take care of his own children when they have need. God provides the needs for the birds. He'll provide our needs as well. This, incidentally, is the first of two illustrations in this context of God's care and provision for his creation, and that includes us. God provides for, God cares about his creation. Incidentally, the feeding of the birds is referred to back in Psalm 147, verse 9. That tells us way back there, God takes care of the birds. God provides for what is his. His terminology in verse 24 is interesting to me. He says, they don't build storehouses or barns. Isn't that interesting in close connection with the parable that went before it? What did that old rich guys do? He said, well, I've got so many goods, I don't have room to store them. So I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger barns.
Mm-hmm.
Just the opposite of what Jesus is teaching us to do. We need to be more like the birds. We don't have to store things away for the future, because God will be in the future as long as he's in the present, as well, I should say, as he's in the present. God takes care of his children now. He'll take care of them tomorrow. He'll take care of them next week, next month, next year, next century, if we happen to be in a period of time when we'll lap over a century. Now, we've already done most of our lapping over centuries. But anyway, he'll take care of us, whatever our needs and whenever it is needed. He'll make certain he provides what we really need. Maybe not what we always want, but what we need. And there's a big difference between our wants and our needs.
Yes.
God knows the difference, whether it's just something we want or something that we really, really need. The ravens, the birds, forage for their provisions from one day to another. They don't store up a lot of food. They provide without necessarily thinking of it in these terms. They don't know God the way we know God by divine revelation. But they forage for their provisions from day to day. We sometimes use that expression, we live from day to day, and sometimes talk about our finances are from day to day, and we may not have quite exactly the same vision in view here. The birds trust God. Maybe that's why they can sing so much. They sing all the time. Maybe it just occurred to me. I don't know whether there's any merit to that or not. But the birds do like to sing. They do trust God. God takes care of them.
They sing.
I lost the point I was going to make after that. But he simply emphasizes God cares for them. How much more important are you than the fowls of the air? He will care for us. Verse 25. And which of you, with taking thought or being anxious, the American Standard Version says being anxious, or the New American Standard Version says by worrying. I mean, that really hits home for most of us. We all know what it is to worry, don't we?
Yeah.
Now, you probably know what it means to be anxious. But we very often use anxious in a positive way. I'm anxious for this to happen because it's going to be so good. But he's talking about giving into anxiety.
Yeah.
While anxious very often is used in a context when it describes something that is positive and desirable. Anxiety, famous form of the same word, is rarely, if ever, used in a positive way. It's a negative thing. Which of you, by being anxious, by giving thought, or for what best in our vernacular, for our understanding, which of you, by worrying, got it? Which of you, by worrying, can add 1 inch to your height? Or anything to your being? Worry does not accomplish anything. Unless you count maybe giving yourself an ulcer as being something. But that's about the only thing worrying brings to us. An ulcer. I don't want an ulcer. My father had an ulcer. I knew how plagued he was with that. I don't want an ulcer. So I better not worry.
Yeah.
I better not worry. Worry does not accomplish anything that is good, that is desirable. Worrying simply shows our lack of confidence, our lack of trust in God to provide for us. He said He will. He's proven that He provides for us over and over and over again in our lives. How is it that we still at times find ourselves worrying without maybe making this connection, but we find ourselves worrying because we're not trusting God? And He's proven time and time again. He's trustworthy. He'll take care of us. But we are also anxious about getting things when we first want them. We want them now. We don't want to think in terms of, I want them next week or next month or next year. I want it right now. And if we don't get it right now, we become so anxious about it. We're like little kids.
Yeah.
Want all those things that comes at Christmas time. After Christmas ends, there's planning for the next Christmas already. Before the tree is even taken down from the previous one. We mustn't be like birds, and we must not be like children in that respect. In many ways, children are admirable examples to us. But in some areas, they are not. And certainly they are not when they want something, they see something, they want something, and they want it right now. That lack of patience. Bill?
Yeah, worrying has even caused a big major problem in our fellowship because, nowadays you go to anybody's house, they'll have a heart attack because everything isn't swept the way they like it, or the bed isn't made, or, and we're all the same thing. I'm talking about myself too.
Yeah,
We're all people. And
worry too much
we get
for
too paranoid over our homes rather than just loving one another and having fellowship with each other. And we all do the same things anyway, so what's the big deal?
Okay, Jesus, and good point. Thank you for that. Not only thank you for the content of what you said, but thank you for giving me a break so I could collect my thoughts.
Okay, good.
As to what I wanted to
That's
say.
why I did it.
You did for my benefit. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, what is Jesus telling us? He's telling us God provides. Therefore, trust God. That's what He's in the business. God is in the business of granting our prayers. Did you know that? God is in the business of providing for our needs. Just trust in God. He provides. In the latter part there of verse 24, Jesus said, aren't you much better than the fowls? If God provides for the ravens and the sparrows and all the other types of birds,
Yeah.
if God provides for all of those, yet failed to provide for His own children, then his children must not be important to him. Why does he provide for the sparrows? Why does he provide for the ravens? Because
they
they're important
trust
to
him.
him. They're part of his creation.
Yeah.
They're important to him. If God would provide for them, but he won't provide for mankind, what does that mean? We're not important to him. But we are. Over and over again, God has shown us we are important to us.
Yeah.
So we can trust God. And so we can look at the birds, and when we see birds flying and swooping down periodically to find something or other to eat, and always find something to eat, we can remind ourselves, God is providing for me the same as God provides for them. They can be a perpetual thing of illumination to recall to our minds what we're talking about now. Every time you look at a bird, you say, God created that bird, and God cares for that bird. But don't stop there. Then say, and God created me, and therefore God will care for me. Yeah. Just a little something for you, especially if you're one of our bird watchers, if that's one of your hobbies. Just when you look at those birds, remind yourself, God is providing for them. And if God provides for them, he's certainly going to provide for me. So why am I worried?
Exactly.
God will take care of me.
God is it.
God will take care of you. Yeah.
Brother
It's that
Brown.
simple. Yeah.
I just was, when you're talking at the house where Sister there where we still living, she used to feed the birds. And so we took over, because they land in the backyard, they land on the patio. And I guess she used to do it at the same time. And then they knew something was wrong after she passed because there was no food, and we forgot to do it. And then one morning, it was about 10, 11 o'clock, and we looked out there. They were all sitting up on the fence because they know they're waiting for the food, the seed that is thrown, and all of them lined up on the fence. I said, why are these birds just lined up on the fence, just waiting? And then Sandra found, she said, oh, you know what, we forgot to put the bird seed out there. And so we put it out there, and they died down there. They were sitting up on the fence, they died, and they ate everything. So, yeah, they know what to do. They're smart. God put it in them. They know somebody is going to do something. Whether somebody do it or not, they'll go to the next house and find something.
That does also illustrate that God provides things in
Yes.
different ways.
Yes, yes.
The way he provides for something one day may not be the same way he provides for it the next day.
Right.
But he still provides.
Yes.
He'll find a means to provide whatever we really need. So we don't have to worry about, now, how's it possibly going to work out? How's God going to accomplish this thing for my benefit? That's God's business, how he does it. You just sit back and enjoy the fact that you have assurance God's going to take care of you, one way or the other. One writer said, why then, because God provides for our needs, why then must man make such feverish preparation for the future as if it all depended upon him? That is the man himself. Why do we make such feverish preparation for the future as though everything depended upon us?
Yep.
It doesn't depend upon us. It depends upon God. I'm not saying we don't have to work for our living. That's one of the ways in which God arranges to provide for our needs through our working. The Apostle Paul had something to say on that line. If any man will not work, neither shall he eat. Now, he's not talking about men or women who cannot work physically or don't have any means of working, but he's speaking in a general statement. If one is capable of working, has opportunity to work, if a man will not work, neither shall he eat. But God provides for those who do utilize those provisions of his grace. God provides us with jobs. God provides us with income. It may not be exactly the type of job we really want, but maybe he'll provide opportunity for advancement or through some other better position. But we just need to recognize that that's one of the ways in which God provides for us. Though we work for a living, that doesn't mean we've earned it. It's like our salvation. We're saved, but that doesn't mean we earned it. We didn't earn our salvation. God provided for it through Christ. We don't earn everything we make on our paycheck, but God's providing it. Never leave God out of the picture.
Right.
Never take God's blessings and provisions for granted. Recognize the source of all the things in life that you enjoy and say, that came from God.
Amen.
Have you ever just driven down the coast and looked at all the glories and the majesty of God's creation? Or gone up to the Sierra Mountains and just enjoyed all the glories and grandeurs of God's creation and say to yourself, my Father did that.
Yeah.
My Father provides that for my benefit and my enjoyment.
Yeah.
Jesus, I want to add this because this is an important point that needs to give us a balanced picture of what Jesus is teaching. Jesus is not condemning foresight and reasonable planning for the future. When he says, don't worry about things, he's not saying don't make any plans for the future at all. He's not forbidding planning for the future. He's not forbidding a reasonable amount of foresight being exercised, but he's emphasizing, or he's talking about being filled with anxiety and worry and just worrying ourselves to death.
Yeah.
But worse than that, and that sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Worrying ourselves to death, but worse than that, demonstrating that we really don't trust God to do what he's promised us.
Yeah.
So our Lord is not forbidding us to save money, have a savings account, if we're able to do that with what we have available. He's not condemning us from planning on having a retirement plan. He's not condemning those things as long as we're not putting our trust in those rather than placing our trust in him. And as long as we're not filled with anxiety, oh, what about my money in that stock market? I'm not sure that I would want money in the stock market. Those people, talk about people with ulcers, those people with lots of money in the stock market, those people have ulcers on a big scale. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, you've heard of survivalists, is that how you say it? Survivalists?
I think you got it right.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say, yeah, this is how it's pronounced because I probably flub it up worse than you did.
Yeah, and I've known some of those people, and it's kind of a ridiculous thing because they're providing for themselves and thinking they're going to be in that house when bad things happen. What if they're in San Francisco when the earthquake comes? And then how are they going to get to their survivalist house? They simply got all their stuff in it and everything they need. I mean, it's a dumb thing, but
Yeah.
you worry about this and worry about that.
So you're speaking of someone who feels that a society, a civilization is going to crumble, and so
Yeah.
they want to have a place for
They're going to go on.
some desert area or some deserted area, not necessarily a desert as we think of it, but build some place there for themselves in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. That would not seem like a realistic form of preparing
No.
for the future.
But they
As
believe
Christians, we don't have to worry about that.
I
But
know.
you're right. People feel like they have to prepare themselves for every contingency, and they get some ideas in their mind about what's going to happen or what may happen, and then they act accordingly and throw a lot of money into some investment. Like how many people bought, what were they called, back in the 50s, during the Cold War, and people were buying, they had a place in the backyard, or maybe it'd be under the,
Shelter.
for rations and
what was
stuff.
that?
Shelter.
Shelters.
Bomb shelters.
Bomb shelter, that's it, thank you. We'll put it all together, put all those words together.
Yeah.
Bomb shelters. And people put all kinds of money, and some of them had very elaborate things. I mean, they had comfort because they were able to afford it. They had comfort in their bomb shelters. Of course, I've never figured out what they were going to do after the oxygen ran out in their bomb shelters. Then they're going to be up a creek.
They didn't think of that part.
But the point is a valid point that you're making, that we can throw away money on things that are not of real value. Just God.
Yeah.
God is our best insurance.
Yes.
God is our best insurance. Trust God. We're not saying you cannot do those things, and if you want a bomb shelter, if you can afford it, if that's your thing, go ahead and build a bomb shelter. But don't trust in that bomb shelter, or whatever you call it. You may not call it a bomb shelter. You may just call it your survival shelter. But what happens when your neighbors start knocking at the door and needing help? You gonna turn them away? I stopped reading someplace, and I have no idea where I stopped reading.
25.
Verse 25, thank you. I'm glad somebody was watching you. Verse 20, that's why I drive also. I'll drive it around and I'll go this here and there, and I don't remember how I got back. I need to go back to get it. I do that in Los Angeles all the time. I'll get lost in Los Angeles within 6 blocks of a hotel. Anyway, verse 25.
No, you finished. You did
Oh,
25.
I finished verse 25. Finished verse 20. Did I really, or do you just don't want me to hear talking
Oh, we
more
really
about it?
did. Really.
Okay, verse 26. If ye then be not able to do the things, those things, or that thing, which is least, depend on the translation. If ye then be not able to do that thing which is least, why take ye thought for the rest? Now that's in the context of the statement. And which of you by taking thought or being anxious can add one measure to his stature? Man's worry cannot give him any greater height nor any greater longevity. If we can't even do that, if we can't do things to our body that is really going to make it, I mean, some people want to be taller, and so they wrap a thing around their neck and hang themselves in the closet for several hours a day, hoping that their body will stretch. I'm not making this stuff up. There's a lot of weird people out there in the world. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Anybody here try that? I'm curious as to whether that works. If you want to make yourself a little taller, or you want to make yourself sure of getting older, to extend your lifespan, and you may take all kinds of things offered in all kinds of stores. I started calling them additives, and that's what they really are. All stuff, this stuff you blend it up in your blender, and you drink that every day. I had a friend in high school. He'd go home every day, and he'd blend up stuff in the blender, and he'd take whatever vegetables were in the house, and he'd stick them all in the blender and blend them all up, and it turned out to be a green blob. It was green. And he asked me, would you like to sample this? I said, no, thank you. One day his father came in and saw him doing that and said, how are you able to drink that stuff?
What is he trying to do to his body?
He thought it was healthful. And he may have been correct, because he did use fresh vegetables. He just put them all together. Carrots, bananas, or fruit also, but whatever was available at the time. He'd go through the refrigerator, take a sampling of each thing, stick it all together, blend it up, and drink it.
Wow.
Well, that might be healthy, but on the other hand, I wouldn't count on for extending your life very long. Verse 27 then, change of figure. The primary figure in the verses up to this was the figure of the birds. God takes care of the birds. God takes care of the birds. Now the figure changes to the lilies of the field. It changes from birds to the flowers of the ground. Verse 27. He says, consider the lilies. Same terminology with which he began verse 24. Verse 24 he began, consider the ravens, the birds, that they don't sow or reap and so forth, but God takes care of them. Here's another parallel illustration, verse 27. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, neither they spin not. And yet I say unto you that Solomon, arguably the richest man who's ever lived. I am of the firm conviction, based upon the description of the goods and things that flowed into his castle,
Yeah.
or wherever he dwelt, when he was king
Yeah.
of Israel. And all kinds of territories had been conquered, and they got all of this material that came in that Solomon had complete jurisdiction over and access to. I'm of the personal conviction, based upon the value of things at that time and placing things today on the same value level, I believe Solomon, adjusted for inflation is the terminology that most people would use. Solomon, adjusted for inflation, was the richest man who's ever lived. That is my firm conviction upon the description. I'll admit the description does not go into a whole great deal of detail, but we have enough description back there in the book of Kings and Chronicles to give us a pretty good idea of the massive fortune that was at Solomon's grasp. Yeah.
Was it the Queen of Sheba said the half of it have not been told?
Yep.
Yeah.
That was her assessment.
Yeah.
And she was a lady who knew a lot about the value of things.
Yeah.
And she got there expecting great glories and fabulous things of wealth. And you're absolutely right. She said, the half of
Yeah.
the half has not been told
Really
unto
something.
me. Jesus says concerning the lilies of the field, the bird, not the birds, but the
Lilies.
flowers. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, they spin not. And yet I say unto you that Solomon in all his glory,
Yeah.
not when at a low ebb, but at the height of his glory, power, and monetary possessions, Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Don't we love, I think most of us do, maybe some don't, but don't we love, after a long winter, seeing the first buds and the first flowers of spring coming up? Isn't it beautiful?
Oh, yes.
Isn't it marvelous? No, man cannot duplicate that. You may try, but you can always tell it's a duplicate. Well, most of the time. Once in a while, somebody will produce something from that is normally found, naturally found in nature, but his is artificial. And we might get right up to it before we realize that's not real. That's not a real plant, or whatever it might be. That's not real. Yeah, we've got the means to make some very reliable, authentic looking things. I think the things we have at the front of our auditorium are beautiful. The things, the decorations, and I appreciate the ladies who are involved in taking care of those decorations and changing them periodically with the seasons, which I think is appropriate. And I think it's beautiful. But if you get up really close and you look at it, you'll get right up to it, which you really can't hardly do it because they're elevated. But if you got right up really close to it, say, it's still pretty, but it's not the real thing.
Yes.
The flowers that God makes are the real thing.
Yeah.
And they're unrivaled for their beauty.
Yes. And fill you up when you see those flowers.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it does. God takes care not only of the birds, He takes care of the ground by giving them a beautiful mantle. Maybe red or gold or blue or silver, whatever the color might be. All the flowers, all the beauties, but he mentions specifically here the lilies. But all the beauties of God's creation, which man cannot duplicate. Despite his best efforts, he cannot duplicate the beauty of nature.
Man.
Because God's in charge of that. That's God's handiwork. And what really amazes me is I've always got to stop and think, imagine this. We live on a despoiled planet. This planet was overthrown by water in the universal flood. And there's no question in my mind that the flood was universal. It was not a local flood, it was a universal flood. If you don't believe that, why is it I go out on the surface of Nevada, out there in no man's land, and I can see a fossil of a marine animal. What's that marine animal doing out there in the middle of the desert? How did that get? And that is true on I'm told by those who have studied it, by those who are archaeologists, believing archaeologists. They don't believe all the rubbish that is taught in the name of archaeology, but they are truly believing archaeologists. And they say, here, there is evidence of a universal flood all around, and they're usually talking about the fossils that were left by the animals. The waters of the flood hit the Great Basin, where Nevada, half of Utah, and the northern part of New Mexico. The flood infiltrated that area, extended over that area. The marine creatures, we're not talking about freshwater animals, we're talking about ocean animals. And when the water receded, those animals died and left their little carcasses there to, with time, be fossilized. And so I asked the fellow who's a archaeologist, and he says, well, the flood was just a local affair.
No.
Then where do all those fossils come from?
Yeah.
Fossils of ocean animals. Hundreds of years, or hundreds of miles from the nearest body of water, and farther than that, to any salt water, ocean water. Our God does things on a magnificent scale and in a beautiful way. God has created this planet. And I kind of got involved in the discussion of the controversy about the flood, as to whether it was a local flood, which it definitely was not, or a universal flood, which it definitely is, or was a universal flood. But what I started to say in all of that was, sometimes I have to stop when I see the glories and the beauties of this world. I have to remind myself, we live on a cursed orb. God placed a curse upon the earth, didn't he? When man sinned, and he cast Adam and Eve out of the garden, he placed a curse upon this earth. This is the cursed orb. This is what must this world have looked like when Adam and Eve were still in fellowship, complete fellowship with God in the beginning? It must have been overwhelming. If this is just a second-rate appearance of it. Our God is a powerful God.
Amen.
Our God is a loving God.
Yes.
And even though he had to fulfill justice, because he told them, if you eat of that, you're going to suffer the consequences.
Yes.
And God is a God of his word. And they ate. And he brought the consequences upon them, cast them out of the garden, placed a curse upon the ground that is not going to be able to bear things like it used to with such freedom. But instead, you're going to have to labor with the sweat of your brow for every potato you get out of the ground. I'm paraphrasing, all right? You're going to have to labor for everything you get out of that ground. We still live on a cursed orb. God has not removed it. But despite that, it's beautiful. It's glorious. And most of us love to spend some time out there to see the trees and the flowers and the mountains and all of that. Jesus says, think for a minute about the flowers. They grow, They don't toil. They don't work. I mean, have you ever seen a flower out there with a little shovel? That would be bizarre. I should retract that completely. Can you imagine of the flowers just taking care of themselves? God takes care of the flowers. Among all of his other qualities, he's the great gardener. He takes care of the garden of his creation. But the flowers don't work. And yet Jesus says, even Solomon, with all that he had, and all of the brilliance of his kingdom, he was not arrayed like one of these. There are things that God can make that man cannot come close to.
Man.
With all of his knowledge, and with all of his ingenuity, and with all of his inventions, and all of his devices, and all of his computer. Well, that's probably where he gets himself into trouble with all those computers, because they're a source of constant trouble to me. I had a major fight with my computer just this afternoon, when after 3 hours of work, this thing decided it was going to drop everything I prepared up to that time.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, that's one of the difficulties of living in our society, where computers kept kind of taking over things. God loves us and God provides for us. He proves it. God takes care of his creation. He takes care of the birds. He takes care of the flowers. Aren't we part of his creation? Will he take care of those parts of his creation and overlook our needs? That would be absurd for us to even entertain the thought that he would ignore our needs while taking care of the birds and the flowers. That's absurd. Of course he cares for us, and he ever will care for us. Yeah, Paula.
I was just going to say, worrying actually detracts from getting the problem solved, whatever problem it is.
As a general rule, that is true. Yeah, it just makes things more complicated. And we are not at our best in trying to determine things. Our logic suffers, our ingenuity suffers when we're worrying. We're just not thinking straight when we're worried. And the more we're worried, the more haphazard is our thinking. And so that's a very good and a very valid observation. Yeah, when we're worrying, we're just not at our best. And it usually winds up just making things worse.
I just want to say quickly, you said take care of the birds. I was in Brazil about 8 or 9 years ago, and we were living in a compound. We went over there for 2.5 weeks for a campaign to help the minister. And we lived in this campaign, this big thing. It looked like it used to be a military thing, but that's what we had to stay for 2.5 weeks. We were standing outside. It's a great big yard, tall, kind of grass about this tall. And all of a sudden, and it had like white stuff on top. And we kept seeing the grass at the top kept moving, but the wind wasn't blowing at all. And we kept wondering why those leaves is just moving, swaying. And so we went to look closer. There was an army of ants. Mm-hmm. They were carrying all this stuff they was carrying something on their head. And we kind of followed them to see where did they get it from. We never could find it because when we kept looking, for his back looked like it was 100, looked like soldiers. They had carrying whatever little spikes on they were carrying stuff on their heads, and they were following, I guess, the leader of this 100 trail ant. They were carrying it into a hole, I guess, storing up for them, whatever they were doing. But we stood there and watched them for a whole hour. Nobody bothered, nothing bothered. I said, I've never seen anything. They had like little soldiers on their head and carrying and doing what the leader telling them to do. They all went into this big hole and one delivered their goods. They came back out to get some. God takes care of those, isn't that? I said, well, we should have took a picture of that.
Nature is
It was wonderful.
Now, for those who may go away, we're almost out of time, for those who go away and think, why did we spend so much time talking about the lilies and the ravens? I want you to remember this every time you look out your front door. I want this to be echo in your memory when you open your door tomorrow morning. You see the sunshine, you see the whatever the sky's going to be. I think whether blue or gray makes no difference. God's in charge. We need both the blue skies and we need those gray skies periodically. God has given us a marvelous creation. And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure exactly what direction the speaker for our, or speakers, whichever it is, for our upcoming meeting will pursue. But I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
I'm looking forward to what they're going to produce
Yeah.
by way of evidences
Amen.
that we might be able to share with friends and neighbors.
Yeah.
But I emphasize the ravens and the lilies deliberately, because I don't want myself to ever lose sight of the glories of God's creation. So that every time I step into the creation of God, that is, outside of my house and into nature, I want to be reminded, this is a testimony to God. He's done all of this, and it's a sign that He will continue to provide for whatever we need as His children. Got 2 more minutes, and so I'm going to take advantage of those 2 minutes to read verse 28, because it'd be incomplete without that verse. Verse 28. If then God so clothe the grass, which is today in the field and tomorrow is cast into the oven, which indicates it's not of a great physical value or monetary value. It's here one day and gone the next. But he says, if God so clothes the grass, which is here today and gone tomorrow, and is cast into the oven, how much more shall He clothe you, all you of little faith? Will God ignore your needs?
No.
Look at the nature around you.
Right.
Look at the animals, look at the birds, look at the vegetation. God takes care of all that. God will take care of us. All we have to do is trust Him and be patient, because God doesn't always work on our timetable. God sometimes takes, because He knows us best, more time than we might wish ourselves, but we have to be patient, because there are lessons we learn in patience. Time is up. Time for us to close up shop here, as it were.